Okay, this is our second video on the psychodynamic approach, which is most closely associated with Freud. In the last video, we started looking at one of his key assumptions, is that of the importance of unconscious processes in determining our adult personality and behaviour. So here we looked at the unconscious mind, using the iceberg metaphor, with the unconscious mind representing all of the repressed desires and wishes and animalistic urges and disturbing memories that we don't have access to. In this video, we're going to be looking at some of the other key assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. We're going to be looking at the tripartite model of personality, the different structures that make up our personality, the id, the ego, and the superego. And we're going to be looking at the psychosexual stages and what Freud believed were those early childhood experiences which determine our adult personality and behaviours. So let's start off by looking at the structure of personality and the tripartite model. So Freud described personality as comprising of three parts, hence the tripartite model. Here we've got the id, represented by a young, screaming, tempestuous child. We've got our ego, our very rational businessman here, and then our superego as well, represented by the judge. And I want you just to think of these as sort of characters that will help you to describe the characteristics and the traits of each of these parts of our personality. So Freud believed that we have these three structures, these three parts to our personality, and that our adult behaviour is the result of a compromise between the three. Each of them have their own wants and their own needs, and it's constantly a battle between them. And this gives its name to the psychodynamic approach. So it's the dynamic relationship between these three parts of our psyche. So let's start with the id. So our id is formed from birth. It's present right from day one, and it's developing between birth and 18 months. The id operates solely in our unconscious mind. We don't have access to our id. Our id represents all the unconscious, innate, instinctual, biological drives within us. So it represents sort of our survival and our sexual instincts, which are the driving force behind our behaviour. It's demanding, impulsive, aggressive, irrational, and selfish, hence why it's best represented by a screaming toddler here. And it contains the libido. So in this case, the libido is our instincts and our primal energy. The key thing that you need to know about the id is that it operates on the pleasure principle. So it is seeking out things that bring it pleasure and avoiding things that bring it pain. And it is like a young child stamping their feet and demanding to want it now. But the problem is the wants and the desires of the id are not always appropriate. You might find people that are what Freud would describe as id dominant, who are heavily driven by instinct and just do and say what they want without any regard for the consequences of their actions. And that would be describing somebody who has a dominant id. So the next part of our personality to emerge is our ego. And healthy adults have a stronger ego rather than id or superego. The ego begins to emerge around the age of 18 months and continues to develop up to about 3 years. And our ego is based on the reality principle. So the role of the ego is to mediate between the selfish demands of the id and the moral constraints of the superego. So it needs to take into account both of the other structures of personality and be realistic and rational in its behaviours. So the id is logical, is orderly, is realistic, is rational, and is based in reality. And our ego is located in the conscious. The ego defends itself from the id-superego struggle, so that tension and conflict between the id and the superego, by employing the defense mechanisms we heard about earlier in the other video: denial, repression, and displacement. Alright, and finally we've got the superego. So our superego is here represented by the judge or an angel, for example. It emerges in the phallic stage of development between 3 and 6 years of age. And it's our conscious. It's our sense of, our conscience. It's our sense of right and wrong. Our superego internalizes morals from society and from our parents, from authority figures, to inform us about what is right and wrong. And it is always trying to get us to strive for perfection and choose moralistic behaviours. So its job is to block the urges of the id, which is doing what is selfish and what is pleasurable, and trying to strive for morality instead. So if we don't achieve that morality, it's going to punish the ego by making us feel guilty if we don't achieve that perfection and that perfect morality all the time. And our superego, like our id, is located in the unconscious mind. So our three structures of personality, our id, our ego, and our superego, are in constant conflict with one another, with the role of the ego to be mediating between the needs of the selfish needs of the id and the moralistic constraints of the superego, and trying to come up with some sort of rational, realistic, and acceptable behavior that will satisfy the wishes of both the id and the superego. Alright, so then we move on to look at the next key assumption of the psychodynamic approach, which is the psychosexual stages. So psychodynamic theory states that events in our childhood have a big influence on our adult lives and shape our behaviours and our personality. He proposed that children go through the same 5 stages of psychosexual development. And he said that if something happens during our development at those particular ages, if there is what he called a fixation that is unresolved, then the child becomes stuck at that stage, and they carry certain behaviours that are associated with that stage into their adult life. So, for example, we've got the 5 stages here. You need to be able to recall this table, particularly the stages here. So a little mnemonic to help you remember the order of the stages. Old age pensioners like golf. And I think, if you come up with your own, that's better, particularly if it's a bit silly or funny or rude. They tend to stick in your memory best. But of course, you do need to know the 5 stages in the correct order, the ages at which they emerge, and a couple of the key features of each of these stages too. So, Freud argued that children pass through these age-dependent stages during development, and all children pass through the same stages in the same order at roughly the same ages. Each stage has a designated source of pleasure. So Freud referred to this as the libido. So this is the pleasure zone. This is where the child receives pleasure. Each stage has a conflict. So each stage, there's a particular resolution that's required. So a child needs to resolve that conflict in order to move on successfully to the next stage. If there's been too much or too little gratification at a particular stage, if they haven't been able to resolve that conflict, then it may result in an adult fixation. So this is how the unresolved conflict at an earlier stage of development in the person's young childhood influences their adult personality or behavior. So if that happens, then there will be traces of that stage that remains in that part of the adult's life. And fixations could be due to over or under gratification at that particular stage. It could be due to trauma at that stage. It could be due to pleasant or unpleasant experiences at that particular stage while overcoming that conflict, changes in environment. There's a lot of different reasons why there might be a particular fixation and a particular reason why that child wasn't able to overcome the conflict at that stage. But I want to take you through a couple of examples. So the first stage of psychosexual development is the oral stage, and this is from 0 to 1 year old. And the libido here, the focus of pleasure, the sexual energy is focused on the mouth. So young children from birth to their first year of age express their sexual energy by biting or sucking. So if you think about a child who's just been born, their only way of experiencing the world really is through their mouth. And they tend to, obviously they're suckling and they're feeding, and so they're getting feelings of comfort and trust through their mouth because they're feeding. And also they're exploring the world by putting like blankets in their mouth and everything. So that's how Freud argued that the source of pleasure or the libido in this stage is the mouth, hence why it's the oral stage. The main conflict, therefore, for this stage is weaning off breastfeeding or weaning off pacifiers. So this is that resolution that needs to be overcome by children. With the source of pleasure being on the mouth, then having to wean off breastfeeding is an experience that they need to be able to get over in an appropriate way. If they don't, for example, if they were weaned off breastfeeding too early, or perhaps too late, or perhaps it was traumatic in some way, or unpleasant, then there might be an oral fixation. So Freud argued that people with an oral fixation, so people that were unable to resolve the conflict in the oral stage of psychosexual development, will have oral fixations. So this could be smoking, nail biting, they might be overly aggressive, they could be sarcastic, they might be sucking on their thumb or chewing pencils. because they're still seeking that source of pleasure through the mouth. So that's an example of the source of pleasure, the conflict, and the fixation of the oral stage of development. We then move on to the anal stage of development, and unsurprisingly here, the source of pleasure is the anus. So the main thing that the child is experiencing at this age is toilet training. And if they're toilet trained too early, if they're toilet trained too late, then this can result in either anal retentive or anal expulsive personality traits. So, for example, if a child is toilet trained too early, then typically their parents are going to be really positive and using reinforcement to encourage the child to hold in their feces and encouraging them when they're able to use the potty successfully. And if this occurs, if there's been too much emphasis on controlling feces, then that person may have an anal fixation, and it means that later on in life, they might be really tidy, really punctual, very, very serious, very obedient. Whereas on the other hand, if the person has been toilet trained too late and their parents were perhaps little bit lax with toilet training, then that person will have an anal expulsive personality. And this means that they're disorganized and really messy, constantly running late, oversharers, that kind of thing, not obedient to authority, etc. The phallic stage of development, so this is between 3 and 5 years. We've got focus on the genitals. And the main conflict that children go through at this stage for boys is called the Oedipus complex, and for girls is called the Electra complex. And I'm going to link you to a video that explains these complexes. I don't want to spend too much time on them because they're so interesting, and I know that if we talk about them a lot, this is all you're going to remember from the psychodynamic approach. But you may have heard the story of Oedipus Rex in classics, for example, so you may know where Freud is referencing his theories here. So there could be fixations at this stage if children are unable to resolve their Oedipal and electoral complexes. So there could be a phallic fixation, so girls may be attracted to dominant men, for example, and boys may become aggressive, for example. We move on to look at the latency stage then. This is 6 to 12 years, and actually the libido is dormant during this stage. There is no source of pleasure. Instead, children at this age are focusing all of their energy on same-sex friendships, on school, on play, on normal childhood things. So there is no conflict to overcome at this stage, and therefore there's no result of not overcoming that conflict. There's no fixation. All right, so then we move on to the final stage. This is the genital stage of development. This is from 12 years onwards, and the source of pleasure returns to the genitals, but this time in seeking satisfying sexual relationships with others. And the conflict here is the establishment of secure adult relationships. And there are various fetishes and perversions that Freud outlined, which are the result of not being able to resolve conflicts at this stage. We're not going to go into too much detail. This would be hours and hours of video if we were just explaining this. But this is the basics of what you need to know. So you should be able to outline each of the stages in order, the ages at which they appear, and a brief description of what's happening at each stage in terms of the source of pleasure, the conflict, and how that affects our adult personality and traits via fixations.